Hey everybody, welcome to episode 83 of the Go Get Outside podcast. This is your host, Jason Milligan. Welcome back, welcome aboard. Today we have a very intriguing episode for you. We will be speaking to Daniel Harm. He has lived a unique life, often influenced by art and nature. He grew up overseas. He's been a pro cyclist. He's a mountaineer. He has spent years of his life building an ornate trail. He's a filmmaker, a tree climber, and an artist who creates films and photography and installations that he considers ecotech futurism. He and I talk about all sorts of things, ranging from all those topics I just mentioned to people's place in society, how we view the world. It's a really good episode. He's super well spoken. I think you're all going to have a good time. So let me stop wasting your time now and let's go talk to Daniel Harm.
My name is Daniel Harm. I call the Pacific Northwest my home. I've been into nature from a very young age. I spent a lot of time out in the wilderness. I grew up internationally, and in my late high school years, I moved back to the Pacific Northwest and spent a long time exploring on bicycles, racing with bicycles, and eventually getting heavy into mountaineering. Through that whole time, I was very involved in the art world, and about 5 years ago decided to fully pursue film, and currently have been making a lot of wild productions out in the wilderness using extravagant mountaineering techniques to create these highly orchestrated stunts. And ultimately, I think what motivates me most to pursue film and art and just to stay engaged in the world is imagining where humans are going into the future with technology and our relationship with the wilderness and Mother Nature, looking for more of a synergy, a stronger relationship where we're utilizing resources in a way that aren't destructive but can in the future be a constructive relationship with nature. A term I like to use in describing my film work is ecotech futurism. So again, just imagining how humans can use all of our innovative skills, all of our collaborative abilities, and all of the amazing ways that we've developed technologies to interact more symbiotically with nature and to just have a constructive relationship with all the life-giving forces on the planet.
I think there's a huge culture shift in general going on now, right? Where we're steadily realizing that we can't just have an exploitational relationship with the environment, that we have to care for it because by caring for it, it cares for us. And so there's definitely a shift culturally in that direction. So it would make a lot of sense that you would shift as well once you got into filmmaking to help push that along, because it certainly needs that help being pushed along.
Absolutely. And the artists that have inspired me are the ones that push the limits, whether it's in music or the visual arts. I like to watch a lot of avant-garde music videos. I'm an avid music digger. I think really what got me into film was the amount of time that I spent going through music. My film is primarily inspired by music and the musicians who I've been following and have been inspired by for a long time. There's so much focus right now on the destructive ways that humans are interacting with nature, and you can feel or see pessimism or cynicism or doubt. And my personal view is right now on this planet, this is the most amount of people that we've ever had who have been concerned. And I'm really into that. And I feel like my films are geared more towards the people that kind of already know and just need inspiration. It's like they understand that, like, oh wow, humans need to shift the way that we interact with nature. We need to treat nature more respectfully. We need to utilize resources more effectively in a way that we're not infringing upon the autonomy of all the other life forms on this planet. I feel like humans are kind of realizing, oh whoa, we're sharing this planet with a whole host of other organisms that need us to understand that they're there.
One of the things that we've come to realize in the last few decades that I think some people realized early on, but overall culturally we didn't really recognize, especially not post-industrial, is just the concept of the ecosystem. and that there's no individual creature that's separate from everything else, that all of the creatures affect each other, affect the environment. It's a huge biosphere of life that when one part of it is sick, the other part is also going to be sick. That's also, I think, a good positive shift that's coming at this point in time. So I think we're going to probably talk about this even more as we get to your filmmaking part, but I want to delve back and kind of get to your path from early on to how you ended up where you are now. I noticed that you glossed over a point where you said, I grew up internationally, which is about as vague as you could get. So explain to us what that means. What was it to grow up internationally?
So I was born here in LA, and after third grade is when I started to move around a lot. That was because of my dad's fascination with travel. And my parents were really young when they had my sister and I, and my dad always had a travel bug. And we were here in LA, and we were doing fine, though you could say that we were just getting by. Like, it was pretty tough. My dad was working a lot. My mom was doing odd jobs, and they were able to give my sister and I a decent life, but we didn't have a lot of autonomy as a family. You know, we didn't have a lot of flexibility or ability to travel. And my dad being so young and raising a family, like, he did a great job sticking around and supporting us. Like, I really commend him for that. And then he also wanted to live his own life. You know, he wanted to have his own identity. And through his job, he's now retired. He was an engineer, and he worked in health and safety management for big industrial companies, refineries, and so forth. Originally, he was a firefighter. My whole family, actually going back 5 generations, were firefighters. So it's strong in my blood. My younger cousin just became a firefighter, which is really cool. So he's keeping the generation going within the firefighting bloodline. It's really cool. Just as a tangent, I'm climbing more with my younger cousin. He's like mid-20s. And now that he's a firefighter, I have like a whole new understanding and respect for what it is, because it was just a part of my family. So I'd just like, oh, okay, whatever. But seeing him, and they have amazing lives. You work for 2 days, you're helping so many people out. It's a very physically demanding job, so you're often really in good shape, the people who take their bodies seriously. And then they get 5 days off to just do whatever. And so they're often extremely adventurous, physically fit, go for it, gung-ho type people. So yeah, my dad, he was a firefighter and then got an engineering degree and got into health and safety management. And we moved around the US a little bit, him going from job to job. And then eventually he's like, let's go way out there, really dive in deep and put the family in a situation where we can travel extensively. So he took a job in Saudi Arabia, and we were living in a city called Al Jubail, the industrial city. It's near Bahrain.
And how old were you at this time?
This was middle school.
Middle school.
Yeah, so my formative years, which was amazing. I think that this was one of the biggest blessings in my life, was being exposed to an immense plethora of cultures during my formative years. You know, I wasn't a kid. Like, I was developing my own sense of identity. I was beginning to have an autonomous relationship with the world. And for example, the school I went to, over 50 countries were represented. I think I can't remember exactly. We'll just say like a few hundred people were in the school. So it wasn't like a tiny little school. It was pretty big. Al Jubail was an enormous city. And when you're living in places like the Middle East, as an expatriate, that's what you call yourself. That's what you're called. If you're not a Saudi Arabian citizen, you're an expatriate. And they have a large expatriate population because of the oil industry there, the refining industries, the industrial industries. Historically, the way the expatriates would live in places that were to them very foreign, they would live in these places called compounds, where they were completely separate from the culture there. You know, you would have the Germans living in their German compound, the Brits living in their British compound, the French living in the French compound, and they kind of just would transfer their culture into this compound. Maybe 100 people would live there. They'd have like a basic store, like a swimming pool in all their houses. It's the closest thing that you can visualize as like a private gated community here in America that's kind of closed off from the rest of the world. Whereas in Al Jubail, the industrial city, it was just like any other city that you would see internationally or here in the US, where everyone was just living together. It was a very international city. I'd say that the Saudi Arabian populace, the citizens there were, I'd say anywhere between 50 to 60%, and the other 40% were all the people internationally who had moved there to work. And that was really, really cool, just to live in such a vastly different culture, for one, and then to go to an international school where you're interacting with people from 50 different countries. And we were taught in a English-British curriculum, so we were taught in English. And I think the one aspect, and I think this is kind of an area of all forms of British American curriculum, from my observation, is there's not a very strong emphasis on really learning other languages. For example, our language course, it was really more of a cultural understanding course. We weren't really immersed in the language.
There is kind of this idea that everyone else will learn our language, so we don't need to bother learning theirs. Yeah.
I find it really frustrating because in middle school, I didn't have the faculties or the understanding of the importance of really learning another language. And I was also a pretty shy kid too, moving around a lot and just being more of an introverted character. That's why I really got in the wilderness, is because it's where I felt most expressed and alive and like connected with the wider world around me. And I think spending so much time in the wilderness is ultimately what developed my extroverted leadership side of being able to produce these film productions where, I mean, at this point in the films that I've created, I've worked with hundreds of people, and I did a photo shoot this summer where there were hundreds of people in it. It's such an amazing feeling. So Saudi Arabia, there for just shy of 4 years, so 5th, 6th, 7th, and 8th grade. It was a wild time. Culturally, young males, boys, have the most freedom there in that culture. They're kind of really revered. And equally important to note is that it was a much different experience for my mother and sister, who had a lot less freedom. And by Saudi Arabian standards, where we were living was very progressive. And so my mom and sister were allowed, if you will, to roam around, to go shopping. You know, they weren't allowed to drive, though there is an infrastructure to support all of the regulations around what women are allowed to do and not to do. So, you know, there's a whole massive infrastructure of drivers, and often households will have a personal driver. They'll just have their driver. They had to wear abayas, which are essentially a choir robe. You know, they didn't have to cover their faces, though at the same time, they definitely got a lot of harassment, a lot of attention that they didn't really want, which I feel like a lot of women in this world get. So that was very fascinating to observe, both on a subconscious level and on a conscious level as a kid growing up there, just all the cultural variance and gender dynamics. Though for me, in my personal experience, I was just allowed to roam around. Out of all the places I lived and out of all the kind of epochs of my relationship with my parents growing up, I had the most freedom in Saudi Arabia. That my parents were pretty like strict, sheltering parents, even though we grew up in all these wild places internationally. And in Saudi Arabia, I was really into rollerblading and street hockey and also climbing trees. I've always been into climbing trees from a very young age. That's like the first place I go. Is anywhere I go, where's the trees and where can I climb them? It's kind of like my escape route from the rest of the world.
There are a bunch of them right around you right now you can climb.
There's some beauties out here. Wow, there's actually a pretty tall pine over there. Nice. That looks like a ponderosa. And in Saudi Arabia, Al Jubail, the industrial city, it was being built in real time. They were planning an infrastructure for a large upswing in population. And so 2/3 of the city was occupied. And the other third was just empty buildings in various states of completion. And yeah, I had buddies there, and we would just roll around on rollerblades and just explore. Kind of had the feeling of like an apocalyptic abandoned area, you know, like not just destruction, but just being able to wander through half-built apartment complexes. You know, everything there is just concrete and asphalt. It's not like we were living in the desert with camels, though we did get out to the desert a lot. It was like a very sharp boundary line. You had the city, and then beyond the city, it was just sand dunes as far as the eye can see. And, you know, the expatriates, their pastime, and the locals and the Saudi Arabians, a lot of people's pastime who were comfortable going out in the desert was just, you know, jumping in a Jeep and a 4x4 and just cruising out into the stars. And the stars there, I guess I have seen some places since then, though from my recollection, I can't remember anywhere that I've been where the stars were just so vibrant and more stars than black sky.
I know that's an interesting thing, right? Is as soon as you go somewhere where you can sincerely see the night sky, you realize it's dark, but it's not nearly as dark as you expect because there's so many pinpricks of light.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's amazing.
It's absolutely amazing. It's stunning. I mean, you really, when you don't have light pollution and there's not a strong moon, it really feels as if there are more stars in the sky than there are blank spaces or space or blackness.
Once I went somewhere where I could see the Milky Way and I could see how many stars in the sky there were, it really made me start to appreciate how ancient humans would look up at that and then try to interpret it in some way, because It's very different than what we're we're used to looking at normally in cities.
Absolutely. And I'll return to the storyline of Saudi Arabia, though tangentially, speaking of the ways that ancient humans looked into the sky and began to wonder why that exists, and building all of these mythos and these understandings, that has been a strong primary influence in my artwork. I love researching into ancient ways that humans have interpreted and interacted with the universe, with the cosmos, and with our human existence as well. Like the perception of human existence and consciousness. I find it so fascinating, so fascinating. So yeah, Saudi Arabia, cruising around on rollerblades, an amazing time. And after 8th grade, my dad moved to Holland, to the Netherlands. So it's pretty interesting that you're going in between about as polar opposite as you could get as far as culture. Saudi Arabia, you could call it a very conservative country, and then you could call the Netherlands a very progressive country.
And you're also heading into high school simultaneously.
Heading into high school, yeah. And that's where my family began to kind of break apart. And a lot of that was just because our family did need to break apart in many ways. Since we were such a young family, I mean, my parents were pretty much teenagers when they had my sister and I. We were all growing up together in a lot of ways. You know, it's like when you're raising a kid, your own personal growth rate kind of slows down, and then your kid has a really fast growth rate. So in many ways, I feel like my sister, my mom, and my dad and I were all growing up at the same time. And in Saudi Arabia, the schooling only goes up to 9th grade, and my sister is 3 years older than me, so she had to go to boarding school. And at that time, my mom, she just wanted to get out of Saudi Arabia, and my sister was going to boarding school in Austria. And then when my dad's contract ended in Saudi Arabia and he decided to move to the Netherlands, that's when my sister was going to college. And so she decided to move back to Seattle. My grandparents are from Seattle, like my whole family's from that area, the greater Seattle area. So that was our sense of home. For example, throughout this whole time moving around the world, Saudi Arabia, Holland, almost every summer I would go back to the Pacific Northwest and spend summers with my grandparents. And that's really where my relationship with nature began, because they had 10 acres and parts of it were pretty wild, just overgrown, you know, little rivulets, little tiny streams in the wet season, just moss fields, ferns, big old trees. It's either like hang out with my grandparents or go outside and play. Those are my two options.
Yeah.
There weren't other kids around.
Yeah, and the forests in that region, they're almost primordial.
Yeah, very primordial. It's just very strong energy there. So my sister, she cruised back to the U.S. along with my mom. My mom just wanted to get out of Saudi Arabia and just kind of launch into her own world. So I was living with my dad in Holland, and that's where I first started getting into bicycles. And again, I was a shy kid, you know, like my dad was just a little unnecessarily overprotective, and he was just worried because Holland was so progressive. He didn't want like all the dark alleyways of the Netherlands to corrupt his young son. And at that time, I mean, I'm a very athletic person. I raced bicycles for 10 years at a pretty high level, and I've done some wild feats mountaineering. But at that time in high school, I was kind of an awkward, late blooming kid, a little bit pudgy, just had no signs at all of being anything athletic. If anything, I was kind of the kid that got thrown into lockers, you know? I was into DJing and I was into mountain bikes, and I would just read through DJ magazines and just spend hours and hours and hours going through mountain bike magazines. I don't know why I was so fascinated with it, but to me, it was just like this whole other universe. I think a lot of it was just like equated to freedom. It's like, oh my gosh, being on this like super fancy machine, you know, like boys like to geek out on toys, and then having this machine that just like can take you anywhere, and also just the thrill of it too. That was like me wanting to become, I don't want to say an adrenaline junkie because I don't really like that connotation. It's like there's something a little bit rash.
It's a really dismissive way to look at something. I feel like anyone who ever refers to someone as an adrenaline junkie hasn't bothered to take a moment to try to look at it from their perspective and imagine what could be attractive about something.
Yeah. And I mean, in a lot of ways, like adrenaline junkie has this connotation of being irresponsible,
rash.
Or rash,
Yeah.
Exactly. Where, I mean, when you're in these places where adrenaline can be on the line, if anything, it's like a mastery of adrenaline. It's like getting into these meditative states where the whole point is to have shit not hit the fan. The whole point is to put yourself where you're in as much control of the situation as possible. So it's more of like just mastering the sensations of adrenaline, of being able to be in these extreme situations and be in control and be patient. I mean, safety protocol is so important. I feel like a lot of people who don't have experience in the mountains or doing these, feats of exploration don't understand how conservative these feats really are.
People also don't see the moments that aren't the exciting moments. So people are used to seeing like some Red Bull video or some GoPro video or something, which is the exciting adrenaline-fueled moment, and not everything that led to that moment and everything that came after that moment.
I was taught by some of the best rock climbers and mountaineers in the world. They taught me rope protocol, safety protocol, just climbing techniques. Mainly what it was is I wanted to kind of just do my own thing, and there wasn't really a book for it. I wanted to do these stunts for film. Like, essentially, how do I get humans in these really remote locations and have them be able to strike these poses where they don't even look like humans anymore. They look more like deities or like, other beings or creatures, kind of defying the laws of physics. And how do I do that safely?
Right. So you were not an adrenaline junkie. You just really liked mountain bikes and DJing.
Correct. If anything, I was like not very skilled at mountain biking in the beginning. And
the adrenaline was mostly from ignorance, not from excitement.
Exactly, yeah. I mainly just geeked out on really fancy bikes and dreamed about them. And then I had this, it essentially was like a Huffy type of just like crappy department store bike that I had that I would just like clean and repair over and over again. Just trying to learn out how bikes work. And Holland is a very unexciting place for mountain bikers. It's extremely flat and you just have bike paths, and the nature places that are there are very rare and they have fences around them. And I had two mountain bike friends, Eric and Brent, and we would cruise around looking for places to go mountain biking. And any place to go mountain biking, you weren't allowed. And a lot of that was because you would damage the area. And at that time, like looking back, we rode on places that at this point in time I would never ride on, but we were ignorant kids. We didn't know any better. We weren't trying to do something. And if anything, that kind of mentality gives me a lot of sympathy for greater humanity and what we're doing. I don't think a lot of the destruction is intentional. I don't think that.
Absolutely.
I just think a lot of it, we're just figuring it out, like we're becoming more and more conscious.
There's also a certain level of comfort you have to attain before you can stop focusing on mere survival and start focusing on your impact.
That's absolutely it. I was actually having a conversation with my friend here who I'm staying with, where it's almost this state of privilege to be able to reflect and be like, oh, whoa, we're making an impact. Or to make conscious choices to decrease your impact, you have to be living in a pretty comfy place in life. If you're just fighting for survival, you're not going to care about what your impact is, and you may not even realize it.
If you're going to tell me don't kill a rhinoceros because of something that doesn't readily affect me, and I know killing a rhinoceros will bring me large quantities of money that can sustain me for months and feed my family, or I can go do the things I normally do and struggle to feed my family, I'm going to kill a rhinoceros. It's finding solutions amongst ourselves to elevate the other groups of people so that they also can recognize not only what their impact can be, but be in that place where they can consider their impact because they don't just need to survive.
Absolutely. I think education is so vital, and helping others get to a place where they are living more comfortably so they have the time and the ability to reflect on the larger direction that humanity is going. If you're so concerned about your basic survival, you don't have the ability to just go into the state where you can think about the larger extent of where humanity is going.
And the thing is the opposite of our goal ends up being the result, which is, to go back to the rhinoceros situation, this person is then treated as a criminal for poaching a rhinoceros, and so then they start to see the groups of people that are trying to protect the rhinoceros as the enemy, which then makes them even less likely to not want to kill a rhinoceros and respect a rhinoceros. So it just starts forming this downward spiral that doesn't improve the situation, but only harms it.
I completely agree.
And this has a lot to do with mountain bikes in Holland. I know it does.
That's where I really got into mountain biking. And just to speak of some fun memories, there's this one place called Dunrail, and it was essentially an amusement park. And it was like the one area where they had like legit hills, and it was a large swath of land that they had amusement rides, and they also had trails, and they had an artificial ski slope. It was almost like if you took like a toothbrush and all the bristles were just way thicker and more spread out and harder plastic. It was like that. It was just...
So when you say artificial ski slope, you mean they didn't even put ice or snow on the slope? They just
plastic.
Tried to mimic the texture.
Yeah.
Okay.
They just created some kind of texture that had like the same type of friction as snow, and I guess they were almost like normal skis in a way. I'd say the hill was maybe like 8 stories tall. So nothing massive as far as hills globally go, but by Holland standards, it was a mountain.
And by mountain bike standards,
it was
pretty
high.
It
was the bomb, especially for these high school kids that weren't really good at mountain biking.
Especially when everything else around you is flat.
Exactly, yeah. And so what we would do is we would sneak in there and go down this thing during off hours, and we would get chased by the Dunrail cops like all the time. And eventually we did get legitimately busted and put an end to that. But we did that for years. I mean, we essentially just roamed around trying to find places to mountain bike, and they were all illegal. I think this is the story of a lot of mountain bikers' quandaries. I don't want to support that. I think that riding down a plastic hill wasn't that bad for the environment.
Yeah, there could maybe be some arguments that the environment was impacted long before your bike tires got there.
Exactly. Nonetheless, a great memory. And so after my sophomore year in high school, I wasn't working in Holland. It wasn't working out for me. I didn't really like the school there. I didn't fit in. And I was homesick for a place that I didn't really know what was home. But nonetheless, my sister was in Seattle, my mom was in Seattle, and so I decided to move back. So for my junior and senior year, I moved back to the States. And ever since then, Seattle has been home base for me. Yeah, junior and senior year is when I really started getting into mountain biking. And that's when I started to see myself as an athlete, and a lot of that was because of having these key mentors in my life who saw how I was going through puberty, saw my physiological dimensions, and were like, you need to get into sports. And it was really perfect for me, and it was a lifeline. It was a savior. Now, being 34 years old, this is the most content and engaged and stable I've ever felt. I'm so stoked to be alive, and the world is just so wondrous and exciting. Though in high school, my world was really small and I didn't really quite know where to go. Like, the world was just this giant, confusing, scary mess to me. And athletics gave me a reason for existence. Like, it gave me an outlet. It kept me on the straight and narrow. It gave me a purpose, and it gave me a sense of identity as well. I had no idea who I was or anything, and it wasn't quite conscious. It was more of just like my subconscious mind was just like, oh, athleticism. This is just what keeps me going. And so in high school, I was doing 2 disciplines. I was into mountain biking for fun. I was kind of going down the notion of free riding is what they called it back then. It's like when big suspension bikes were hitting the market, and all these crazy mountain bikers are like jumping off 40-foot cliffs, and
those adrenaline junkies.
All those adrenaline. Yeah, maybe you could call those ones. But yeah, so I started rolling with this crew of mountain bikers. There was 4 of us, Jay and Andy, the twins, and Aaron. And I went to high school with Aaron. And, we did some ridiculous stunts. Like, our senior year in high school, in one of the main buildings, there was this flight of stairs that would just kind of like crisscross down. And we during one of the class breaks, we took our bikes to the very top of the 3rd floor and just like mountain bike down these flights of stairs, like inside a building. And we didn't get caught or anything. And that was really fun. And high school for me was just mountain biking. Because of my dad working internationally, the arrangement that he had with his job paid for school. And so, of course, they just sent me to whatever the nicest school was. It wasn't a pay cut for my dad. It was just a part of, like, when you live in countries like Saudi Arabia, the companies you work for make it worth your while. And they give you a lot of travel stipends. And so, just to give an example, by the time I was 14, I had visited like over 30 countries. In the Middle East, a lot of Americans don't have that experience. And in the Middle East, 15 countries all fall in the same area of the states. Everything's really close, just like Europe. It's not a big deal to visit 30 states.
Right. Yeah.
It's the same deal, but nonetheless, you do have a lot of cultural differences. In the Middle East, it's absolutely fascinating. Yeah, so mountain biking, Andy and Jay, the twins, they also were simultaneously into rock climbing. And that's how I really started getting into mountaineering. And I owe a lot of it to Andy. And Andy, he's one of the best climbers I know. And he really just started pushing the limits. It was once we both started going to college that we all started getting into our specific disciplines and began to take them really seriously. And Andy was the one who really pioneered climbing for the group. He's a brilliant individual, not just athletically, but just on a conscious level. Just one of the most capable people all around that I know. And from a very young age, we're talking like late teens, early 20s, was just consuming climbing book after climbing book. Advanced climbing skills, Mark Twight's lightweight alpinism. Mark Twight's a friend of mine and amazing mentor. You should definitely check out his work. His book, Kiss or Kill, was pretty life-changing for me, just to meet another soul who had really struggled to keep afloat in the world and found athleticism as a reason to live and then eventually flourish as a human and reach a state of positively affecting so many people around him. And I'm sure he's still surprised that that's where he's at in life. So yeah, Andy started pushing the limit with climbing, and I was still into mountain biking, and I was working at bike shops. I started working at bike shops when I was 14. When I would come back to the States, I started working at bike shops in the summer, and that was my main employment. And I ended up going to the UW and just totally hit rock bottom. And I was studying pre-med just because that's what I was supposed to do, kind of deal, and going to these massive lecture halls with 400 people. And that's just not how I learn. And at the time, I didn't understand that it's not that I didn't like education or learning. It's just that that was not the environment where I could learn effectively. I just completely checked out. It's just, there was no way for me to be engaged. Being 100 feet away from this screen with this information was just over my head. I'm the type of person where I can learn anything if I sit down side by side with someone and they walk me through it. And then also I can teach myself a lot. I've been autodidactic in film and a lot of other disciplines, but large lecture halls, especially at that age, not my cup of tea. So I ended up dropping out of school. This is a ridiculous story, but I skipped all of my final exams to go mountain biking in Canada. Kid you not. And I was not terribly surprised when I got a letter from the university saying that I had been dropped from the school. It was a pretty powerful wake up, honestly. I was kind of a dumb kid that didn't expect that to happen. You know, like for so many kids, everything's just kind of given to you. It's not a privilege to go to school. You just go to high school. You just wake up and you go. And then all of a sudden it'd be like, oh, I can't wake up and go to school. And that's where I really started to grow up quick. At that time also, I had created a rift in my family and I'd moved out. I started living on my own when I was 17, again, just working at bike shops. And gosh, I forgot about rowing as well. So rowing was the discipline that really taught me that I had a lot of aerobic capacity. It's just, I was a very fit individual, had a lot of potential in that. And I essentially got recruited to row at the UW. That's why I went there. And I was really, really good at it physiologically, but I wasn't mentally stable of enough a person to really put all of my focus and energy into it. I had a lot of growing up to do internally. And so when I dropped out of school, that was just like a shortcut to figuring out life. And I'm pretty proud of myself because I realized like, oh, whoa, I actually want to be in school. I love education. What I would mostly do with my free time is read. I'm a avid reader. I just pound books. And so I was like, wait a second, like I'm failing out of school, but like on my own, I'm just reading. Maybe I should go back to school for what I'm reading. You know, I was studying pre-med and I love sciences, but the way that universities teach a lot of the hard sciences and mathematics just wasn't engaging for me. And I loved a lot more of the theory of it. I would read books on theoretical physics and all these like fringe physics theories and read tons of philosophy and I loved mystical texts from the past ages. And I would read that on my own when I was 18 or 19. So I was like, well, maybe I should go back and study something similar to that. And at the time, the closest thing I could find was philosophy and literature and creative writing. So I ended up taking classes at community college, and I knew that school was really overwhelming for me. So that my first quarter at community college, I just took one class. You know, and I got a 4.0, and I was like, okay, the next quarter I'll take 2 classes, and I got 4.0s in both those. And then the third quarter, which is the end of a full year of school, I took 3 classes and then, you know, got straight A's. And I was like, okay, cool. And the whole time I was, you know, working at bike shops, kind of living in like not the best living environments, you know, like going to the food bank occasionally, just barely getting by. But nonetheless, after going to community college and getting straight A's, I went back to the admissions office of the UW and asked if I could go back. And they're like, absolutely. They're like, we rarely see students that take that much initiative on their own. And so I ended up going back to the UW and doing really, really, really well there.
But not in medicine this time.
No, I went back to philosophy and creative writing, 2 degrees, whatever you want to call them. And so dropping out of school is what got me into road biking. That's the segue into it, right? So massive mountain biker. If anything, I made fun of all those skinny tire spandex dudes. You know, I was a star rower, but when you fail out of school, you can't row anymore for the college. And the community college I was going to was pretty far up north, and I didn't have the money for a car. And I was working at this bike shop where there were bike racers there, and the bike racers there, they kind of blurred in between. If you're into bike culture, you're going to know what I'm talking about. But there are these bike racers that blurred in between like the messenger world and the bike racing world. And it was pretty cool for me because I was definitely like into the weird stuff, into rock, into punk, all of that type of thing. In the bike racing world, you have some pretty nerdy, dweeby guys. But the bike messengers, you know, they got tattoos, they got piercings, they're fun, they're wild, they're ruckus. And I was like, well, these dudes, they love skinny tire bikes. You know, at the time, that's when like fixies were starting to be the rage. I ended up racing track bikes for a long time. So I have my own feelings about fixies, but nonetheless, they gave me a single speed, which I think is way more reasonable with brakes. And that's how I got to school, on a skinny tire bike. And then I was like wearing jeans and like a puffy jacket. It's pretty like cumbersome to ride a bike on.
Oh, you started to realize they dressed that way for a reason.
Exactly.
Not for the beauty.
Shit, these Hispanics are super comfortable. Like, wow, I feel so sleek and efficient and mobile. Wow, this is the bomb. My body can move freely, unencumbered. Sign me up. The year that I dropped out of school and started going to community college is the year I got my first skinny tire bike. I still clearly remember like every single detail of the situation. It was after the bike shop had closed. It was dark out. It was in the winter time. I had these like wool knickers that the guys at the shop had given me. And the first time I got on this road bike, it blew my mind. Because I had like a 50-pound, 8-inch travel downhill bike with 3-inch tires, you know? And I get on this road bike and I step on the paddles and I was like, how the hell is this thing going that fast? I felt like I was flying. I was like, why have I been talking shit about these bikes for so long? Such an eye-opener. And every Tuesday night, they would have these fixie rides where it's just after the bike shop closed, we would just mob around town. And some of the Cat 1 bike racers would go on these fixie rides that worked at the bike shop. And there's this one hill that they would go up that's really, really steep. You know, and this is coming off of 2 years of just like super hardcore collegiate rowing. And, you know, and then boom, getting on a road bike. I was hauling ass on that thing. And the racers were just like, dude, you have to race. You have to race. That's all there is to it. That's how that whole career began. And I got to say, it's really bizarre talking about my bike racing career because it lasted for 10 years. And it was a significant part of my life. But it just seems so far removed in the past because the last 5 years in film, it's just been like a time warp. I don't even really remember in my daily consciousness anything that happened before film the last 5 years. Even though it's been super developmental for me, it's not like I've forgotten about it, but it's just not even in my daily consciousness at all. It's so far removed. But I feel so lucky because like bike racing was the best education I could have had for film. Like the mental discipline that is required to be traveling 8 months out of the year, the logistical management. You know, you have all of this gear, you're on airplanes, you're in team buses, and you can't be a shit show and be a bike racer racing full time. Because bike racing is definitely geared more towards younger kids. You know, it's like there's this whole idea that you're at your prime in your like early 20s. And a lot of guys, they don't make it past 30 in professional sports unless they're like hardcore veterans like my friend Adrian Hedgevery, one of my most old school teammates and best friends, who's, you know, winning World Cups right now and doing Olympic bids, and he's the same age. I think he's maybe a year younger. But you know, if you're really, really good, then you're making like a full-on career out of it. But for the most part, you know, like 80 to 85% of like top-notch bike racers, professional bike racers, it's a pretty short-lived career. And then you have like the 15 or 20% where they become these legacies and they do it for like multiple decades kind of deal. So one of the reasons why quitting bike racing was so easy for me, the whole time I was in cycling, I never identified as a bike racer. I did bike racing because I love athletics and I love challenging my body and I love traveling. That's really why I did bike racing. But ultimately, I was an artist. During the off season, I didn't hang out with bike racers. I trained with them, but I hung out with artists. I hung out with musicians, you know. I was always a little bit of an oddball in the cycling world because I like to go to all the crazy wild shows and I was always into the crazy wild things. And bike racing is a pretty like conservative straight-laced sport, and when you're sponsored you have to have a very, very specific image. You can't step outside those bounds, otherwise you can lose sponsorship, get kicked off a team, you know. So I kind of felt like I was living two lives, honestly. So eventually when I was 29, I clearly had plateaued in bike racing, and a lot of it was because I just had other interests. You know, it's like, well, I kind of like mountaineering too, you know. I want to just like mountaineer and not just like obsessively always be in the bike racing world. And if you want want to have a legacy in the bike racing world, you have to be a full-on bike nerd to the T. So I was kind of going through this like weird ego crisis thing because so much of my ego is invested in being a bike racer, and there's this whole like win, 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 win type of thing. And I was like, I don't really care about winning. I love adventure. I love exploring, and like, why am I like beating myself up for not getting on bigger teams or winning bigger races? There's so much life to be lived. And I was kind of looking around me. All the bike racers, they aspire to be on these like big teams that have massive budgets, and it's extremely difficult to get on them. I mean, to break into the pro ranks is really difficult, but even within the pro ranks, it's like 5 to 10% of the pro ranks are actually like well supported, and everyone else is kind of just hanging on for dear life. And I had seen just a lot of other racers around me, they were unable to let go of that identity. And so they kind of like would hit this peak where they were just cream of the crop in the cycling world, and then they would just diminish. The best way I can say is like they just kind of got stuck in that identity. They're just so into the sport, they don't want anything else. But I definitely observed that there were some people, they were just like limiting themselves. And I totally understand. It's scary. Like when you're doing something for 10 years, especially if you hit this like certain peak, it's really hard to let go. Though instinctually I knew that like I just had to have this like massive breakup with the sport. And that's what I did. It's like I hit 29 and I was just like, it's over. It was really disruptive in my life. Like people were concerned about me, especially because the films that I started to do were way the fuck out there. Let's just say they're avant-garde. And so when I quit bike racing, people were like, what is going on with Daniel, And
they're like, you're not quite old enough for a midlife crisis, but this looks like a midlife crisis.
Yeah, it was like a midlife crisis. They also just thought I was like losing my shit, honestly, because here I am like going off into the woods doing these just like wild feats with all these like weird costumes and have these like ritual feel to it. People are like, what the hell is he doing? Is guy going off his rocker? But the reason for that, and I haven't talked about one of the most paramount experiences of my life that very few people knew about, was trail building. That's really what it is. And cycling is easy to talk about because it's relatable. A lot of people like understand it. It's a kind of a big sport, etc. This is an outdoor show. I'm sure there's a lot of cycling enthusiasts, and I still am. Like everywhere in the city I ride a bike. I'm still a huge bike nerd. I just had to have a big breakup to develop other aspects of my identity. It's kind of like cycling caused a detriment to the rest of my existence or my personhood.
That's something I really identify with because that's a struggle my entire life, is I'm one of those people who is interested in a huge variety of things, and it's always that battle of, okay, well, I'm really into this thing, and if I want to be better at this, or if I want to delve deeper into this, it cost me all these other things.
Yeah.
And trying to figure out how to balance that is tricky. And so 10 years of just focusing a large quantity of your life on bike racing, I could see where absolutely you'd realize, well, shit, I'm getting older, and I'm only going to have so many years to try all these other things I want to do in life as well.
That's what it was. And what really helped, so trail building. So for the last 10 years, I worked for a family who owns a piece of property out in this place called Leavenworth. It's in the Central Cascades. It's some of the most rugged granite mountains that you will ever see. Just the most quintessential or picture perfect, just like jagged, rugged, almost like Mordor in the Lord of the Rings. What makes the area so beautiful, it's very steep, just like teeth and claws of granite, and yet it is one of the most robust, thriving ecosystems there is. Because over the eons, you've had all this erosion from the granite, and it's created like 3 feet of topsoil. 3 feet is not a lot, but this 3 feet of topsoil is so dense in nutrients, it supports the same type of biosphere species life as the Pacific Northwest rainforest, but because of the ridgeline system, that specific area, and it's getting closer to eastern Washington, has a low precipitation, and so the growth rate there is a lot slower, and it's different species variation. So you get this land that looks just like a fairy tale. It's not a dense forest. You have these little clumps of trees. So when you're walking around, you have a massive visual field. You can see all of the mountains, whereas if you're in a dense forest, in the mountains, you don't know that you're in the mountains. It's very like kind of claustrophobic. We're there, you just see all of the life, and it's so expansive. And the ground cover, you have all these types of moss. It's fascinating, the species variation there and the plant life. And all the trees, they're all like knotted and knurled because it gets very extreme seasons there. You get these like sub freezing, heavy snows in the winter with these massive freeze and thaw cycles. And that's what creates this just like jaggedness. You'll have these like pieces of granite the size of like buildings and skyscrapers that will just like shatter in the winter and splinter everywhere. And you'll have like giant boulders here. And this is all in like steep 45 degree, 60 degree terrain. So it's a very just like explosive, animated area, but it's also just like blissful and etheric and magical. So the twins, right? Andy and Jay, the climbers, their dad is this just kick-ass architect who just made it in the biggest way that you can ever imagine on planet Earth as an architect. Just a brilliant, passionate individual, and they're raving environmentalist. And they've been massively influential in my life. And so when I was first getting really good at bike racing, like the first year that I was like on a legit team, again, in the bike racing world, a very small percentage of bike racers have paychecks where they could actually raise a family. And then an even smaller percentage is like the 1% of the 10% are the ones that you see on the cover of magazines who have like big sponsorships, etc. Just to give an example, you can have a big professional team with a guy who has $1 million contract and his teammates are like barely paying rent or just like barely able to feed their kids. And they're on the same team, mind you. So when I say I was on a first legit team, essentially just means that you're able to race full time. You get cool gear, you're able to travel. I like got through my 20s without having to pay for anything with bike racing. I just like started my 30s fresh, but I couldn't have raised a kid. I couldn't have bought a house. It took me ages to get a car, but nonetheless, I could race my heart out, So it's cool. I got on a team where I could just race all the time. Oh my God, I made it. But nonetheless, like I still had a hustle. I, still would teach athletic classes. And point being is Andy and Jay's parents bought this like beautiful piece of property in a remote area of Leavenworth and like a real steep, like essentially like they bought like the side of a mountain and
just at a local auction.
Totally. So their parents were like, hey, we want a trail system out here. Eventually they're going to build houses, but we want a trail system. So they're like, hey, get all the boys, like go build some trails. We spent like 4 days, it was like 10 of us, drinking beer, playing in the river, pickaxes and shovels. And we just blazed some what you would call like goat trails, game trail, climber trails, just real basic rudimentary trails. And all the guys are like, oh, we did it, we built the trails. The weekend went by, this is awesome. And I was looking at this, I'm like, I just know this isn't what Annie and Jay's parents are visualizing.
Right.
Like, we started the process for them, but Scott is a brilliant architect and he's one of the most artistically gifted people I know. And he loves craft. And I was like, I think they want something beautiful. And I also I needed a gig and I needed to be close to nature on like a subconscious level. I was really just going through a lot internally, just like really struggling, like trying to like not go to the dark side, if you will. And so they were like, sure, like build trails. I had no idea what I was doing, but nonetheless, I didn't teach myself. I mean, the land taught me. And I first started out just sleeping in a tent. I would work out there. You can only really work in the rainy season, in the autumn and the spring, because in the winter, the ground is frozen solid and you have feet of snow. And in the summer, the earth is so hot, it just turns to dust. And when I say building trails, the best way to visualize what I was building, like imagine an ancient temple on the top of a mountain ridgeline. And down in the valley below, you have the entrance to this pathway system to go up to this temple. And this pathway system is extremely ornate and hand-built. I'm sure you've seen it in like National Geographic or documentaries, just these extremely ornate pathway systems through the mountain up to a temple. And so I spent 10 years doing this. It's dry setting. So what I would do is I would just roam around the mountainside collecting tons of rocks, like literally, like over the course of 10 years, I've moved thousands upon thousands upon thousands of pounds of granite within like a 40-acre radius. I would just go around and just collect rocks for like weeks at a time and just build this like giant pile of rocks the size of a car. And in a month, I would use all of those rocks and I would go back and I would find more and just make another big stash. And getting to the point where you're essentially you need all kinds of different sizes of rocks and you need them to be very strong. They can't crumble, depending upon the pressure of the earth and how it was formed, it can be very, very crumbly, or it can be like extremely dense and unbreakable. But sometimes the unbreakable granite can be too smooth, like a river pebble. Climbers know that granite has a lot of friction. It can fuck you up. It's just like all these little teeth. It's like,
and it can be extremely smooth and slick also, which is not necessarily what you want in a walkway.
Exactly. Yeah. So it was cool. I really got to learn about the landscape, not really knowing what I was getting myself into. It became a very mystical experience because I would work in this environment by myself. It was a solo gig. It's very much like a hermitage. And over the years, they began to start building these ridiculously amazing feats of architecture. It was like Scott's magnum opus as this brilliant world-renowned architect. And so eventually it was like a rite of passage, or this like initiation, where I would go out there just sleeping in a tent, using a camp stove, bathing in the river, just living this very, very return or like down to the earth lifestyle. You know, I didn't own a car. I would just hitchhike out there. I'd bring my bike, sometimes take the bus. And then as they developed the land, I would get more privileges. I could stay in their cabin, etc. And it essentially became into a full-blown artist patronage, where Scott is a patron of the arts. You know, he donates a lot of money into art. And I began to realize that I wasn't just some kid with a shovel. Like, I was creating a large-scale 10-year sculptural installation for this incredible family. And during the time of bike racing, you know, I just picked up like a GoPro and just started filming my process as a trail builder. And that's how I started experimenting with film. Is I was just out in the wilderness by myself for months at a time, building these trails, playing around with film. And anyone who has spent a lot of time out in nature alone, especially when you're talking like months and months and months, it does something to you in an extremely powerful level. The best way I can put it is it just unlocks your mind to be able to see the cosmos in like a whole different light. And what it did for me was it really made me realize how alive nature is. Like, I was always drawn to nature. I was always like a nature kid, but I didn't understand like the magic of nature until there was this one moment. I only used basic hand tools. I had what they would call a rock hammer. It's like a normal hammer, except the hammer end is square and the other end is a very, very sharp pick. And it's perfectly weighted for hammering on rocks. It's like you take this hammer and you hit a rock hard and your hand feels good. There's no vibrations, there's no shock. It's this like beautiful sensation. And then like a small Pulaski, just like a little like garden pick and garden Pulaski, just like real basic rudimentary tools to build this whole system. No power tools or nothing like that. And so it's pretty minimally invasive. The most non-destructive, environmentally friendly way for a human to interact in nature is on a trail system. It's extremely minimal impact. Nature can easily absorb it. Trails require maintenance. If you don't maintain them, they disappear. And so it's a very like elegant way to interact with nature that's very respectful. So there's this one moment 5 years in, about halfway through, about 5 years ago, because this is really kind of what like spawned everything for film, just had this sensation that everything around me was watching me. You know, not in like a creepy way or anything. It was more of like timid observation. Like, whoa, there's this human here that's not fucking everything up. And he's been here year after year after year, and he keeps on coming back. It was almost like all the plants and animals around me were like, is it okay to be friends with this person? Can we trust them? And I just had this moment where I was like, holy crap, I am less aware of my surroundings than my surroundings are aware of me. It's like everything around me is way more aware of who I am than I am of who they are. I'm just staring at the ground, beating on rocks.
Which is a perfect metaphor for humanity. It really is.
Yeah.
And again, not malevolently and partly from ignorance, we're this creature that's like this fully self-centered creature that's learning to be part of its environment.
Absolutely.
Instead of the conqueror of its environment.
Absolutely. That's really the full go. That's the full story. It feels good. I haven't really gone that deep into it. Holy crap. Like, blast from the past.
No, man, you've made this super easy. I've barely had to say anything. You just move to the next thing. I'll be like, well, maybe I'll segue us into this. He already did it.
Yeah, I mean, it all flows together, you know, like it all definitely has been this continuous timeline to get me here. We're now like really within the last few months, you know, I met Jason, gosh, what was it? This autumn, you know, just a season ago.
And today is the first time we physically met in person. Yeah. Otherwise, it's just been through email.
Yeah, totally. Yeah. So the last 5 years, I've been studying film and doing it really non-traditionally. I didn't go to school. I taught myself everything. And I'm very fortunate to have this extensive art community who's just game for wild wilderness adventures. And so the last 5 years, I've just been focused on creating a portfolio to really show the type of work that I want to do. And it's really within the last couple months, if anything, the last month, where everything is just like totally clicked into place. So I feel like I'm just like beginning the beginning in a way, which feels amazing. It's just mind-blowing because, I mean, anyone who works in film or is trying to get their foot in film or any creative industry for that matter, you know, musicians, painters, sculptors, it's difficult to gain traction. It's difficult and it can be really terrifying, especially when you're investing like all of your funds and resources. I mean, you know, it's like essentially every single dime I made trail building just went directly into film, you know, it's just, that was it. I just like everything for film. I knew that I would get to this place, but it was so scary that I wouldn't even like look that far into the future future. It was just like every day was kind of just like damage control. It's just like, just focus on what's going on right now. Focus on what's going right now, you know, go, go, go. And things have just finally like settled into this calm groove where I can just chill. Like everything's just kind of working out on its own. I mean, where I'm at currently is I just started working for a record label that was founded in 1979. This is their 40th year anniversary. And it's called Soundings of the Planet. It's like harp and flutes. I'm super into it. Like I love all types of music, you know. And anyways, the two people that founded this record label, they were like at the very, very beginning of the environmental movement. They like were the ones that really started it all. These two people, so Dean and Dudley Evanson, they had no aspirations of being wealthy at all. They were like the standard kind of pre-hippie, you know. They were like the original souls that were like, hey, we're these Western Americans living on lands that belong to the native and indigenous people of the Americas, where, you know, historically the people of this landscape were extremely connected with nature. So you have these like young Western kids from New York being like, oh, we don't want to like live in this rat race. We just want to like roam around and play instruments and just learn more about nature and learn more about the ancient ways of relating with nature. And at the same time, they were at the forefront of film. Dean and Dudley, they had the very first portable video recorder. I think Sony made it. It was this like 10-pound briefcase with this like 8-pound camera head that they would cruise around, you know, black and white, half-inch reel. And ever since the 60s, they followed every single development in film technology. And so they have a 50-year archive of essentially documenting the entire environmental movement since the 60s. And they've hired me to start putting out this material for the first time out in the world. So for me, as like a filmmaker, it's kind of a dream job. It's the first time I've worked with footage where I'm equally passionate about it as my own. It's like I show up to this record label. They live like on Mount Baker, way out in the middle of nowhere. So I stay out there 4 days a week editing, and then like I can like go snowshoeing at Mount Baker, 40 minutes away from an old growth grove where you have like 1,000-year-old trees that are hundreds of feet tall. It just takes all the heat off of everything. It takes all the pressure off of everything. And a lot of it too, it's like, whoa, like these people making it was never their ambition. Their ambition was just committing their life to music and art and raising eco-consciousness, you know.
It's that classic follow your passion.
Yeah.
And then your passion may lead to success.
Totally.
Yeah.
They're sitting on footage that's 40 years old that has never been publicly released. So like this sense of urgency of like, oh crap, I just made this film. If it's not out in 2 months, it's completely irrelevant. I do think there, you know, especially in the industry, in the commercial industry, there is an importance in getting material out there, getting content out there. And then at the same time, there's also forms of film that just get better with age, just like a good wine. It's mind blowing to look at footage from the 60s. It's just like, holy crap.
What's that process looking like? So are you having to convert everything from film to digital, or are you working directly with the prints? Or
that's why this film has taken so long to get out in the world. Dean has essentially invented a lot of the ways of transferring this footage into digital. He's had to like bumble around in the dark and like how to most effectively do it. You know, there's a lot of devices to convert analog mediums into digital, but it's pretty cumbersome to like work with 40, 50-year-old half-inch reels and have it look good. You can't just like throw a half-inch reel on a 50-year-old machine and plug a digital converter into it and expect it to look brilliant on your Mac.
Right.
There's a lot of little like tweaking and just like really weird things, like how you clean the head with like certain chemicals, and like it's a very involved process. So Dean has essentially been spending the last 2 decades just converting the footage. And it's pretty cool too, because these are people in their like mid 70s who are like super tech savvy. And it's a really rewarding experience for me because Dean has Parkinson's. So his hands are shaky, you know, his eyesights aren't the best. And it's not that he's not capable of editing his footage on a mental level. Like he's a brilliant individual, but here I am. I'm just kind of an extension of his body. You know, I got the quick fingers. I'm really well versed in these software programs, and I'm great with data organization, etc. So I'm just coming in, and I'm just kind of like, the first job was organizing, you know, 50 years of footage.
Right.
We're talking like 250 terabytes worth of footage.
That's a huge job in itself.
Yeah, it was just a giant data organization project with 21 hard drives, and just making sure that every single file and folder had a duplicate on a separate hard drive, a shadow hard drive, because at that point they had no offsite hard drives. So if anything happened to their film studio, literally as the last week was the first time they had offsite footage. So it was like, this is number one, offsite hard drives. So yeah, I'm just really beginning the process. If anything, I'm just learning the extent of the footage and watching a lot of their documentaries. They've made some pretty cool documentaries. So for someone who my films have only been like really wild out there, you can just call them music video style, just like visual entourage and just like, whoa, what's going on? And so it's cool to have a job that is increasing my capability as a storyteller. I've not done any storytelling. I've done like cosmic consciousness storytelling or like metaphysical imagery type of things, but just like legitimate, beautiful, eloquent storytelling, I'm learning like in real time.
What are some of the end results you're working on there? Are you working on several shorter pieces for them, or are you putting together one larger piece, or is it a mixture of those things?
I think that the penultimate goal is to make a documentary that kind of fits in the realm of like Frieda Lee Mock is a big inspiration. Frieda Lee Mock has made some really amazing documentaries. The one that stands out the most to me is Return with Honor. It's definitely worth checking out. It's about the story of fighter pilot jets who were shot down in the Vietnam War and became prisoners of war. And Frieda Lee Mock, I think she founded, it's called the American Film Institute. She's won many, many awards type of deal. They're just beautifully put together documentaries. And so, that's going to take a while for me to get to that level. But nonetheless, I'm watching a lot of documentaries and am very fortunate to now have the source material for it. So it's just a matter of kind of putting it together. But yeah, they would love like a standalone documentary that has like just a universal appeal to it. But in the meantime, the reason why they became so successful is because the streaming era. How could they have predicted that Spotify and Pandora would have came about?
Right.
But their music is meditation music. And so, we're hitting a time where humans want to meditate a lot more. We're trying to explore our internal world. We're trying to like find these states of tranquility, which allow us the space to like think about these bigger questions of like, what is our impact here on Earth type of deal. And so their whole like motto is peace through music. And definitely, very much a part of the environmental music. They were at the very, very first UN conference in Sweden in 1972 that had anything to do with environmentalism. It was the first time that the UN had included environmentalist aspects in their discussions. And they were there, black and white footage, the very first one. And they've just been a part of that from the whole thing. But nonetheless, so they have a lot of followers. They get billions of streams through Spotify and Pandora. So they're able to support a creative team. And they need content, like they're on Instagram. They got like tens of thousands of followers on YouTube. So I'm pumping out content for them, but ultimately they want just like their masterwork complete. So it's just like any commercial field, they need their content, but then they also want the completion of their masterwork to just show their legacy.
Which working on those shorter bits will help you better develop the longer one in the meantime. Yeah.
You nailed it. That's how I'm going to learn. Like this is their 40th year anniversary. So they want to release a lot of like little mini docs on live performances, almost like an album. Like an album, you have like 10 tracks. And so it'd be like a 30-minute film with like 10 different snippets from live performances all strung together. And yeah.
So before we wrap it up, because we have been going for a while and we're eventually going to have to stop, let's talk about, because now you've moved into this new area of your life, which is really focusing on filmmaking and working on these documentaries and various other things. What are some of the goals you've set for yourself?
There's internal goals and external goals. This is the first time where I've had like a stable gig where I feel fine in life, like I can pay my dues. I got a nice car now, or it's just like, it's a Mitsubishi Delica. If anyone out there knows what a Delica is, they're the bomb. So I can get way out in the mountains, everything's cool. And so a lot of it is just like a goal of just being content. It's like we kind of live in this rat race where like we always have to like prove ourselves and like get fame, notoriety, all of that. Not a knock against it, because one of my external goals is I would love to work on much larger projects. Like one of my personal goals is to work with the musicians that I love, like Bjork and the music videos that she's produced with Michael Gondry and all of that. That's what got me into film. That's blew my mind as a middle schooler, seeing Bjork's music videos, being like, what the hell is that? Like humans can make that? Artists can make that? I want to do that. And I would love to do that. I think like in the next 10 years, I would love to just be in a position where there's no thought anymore. I'm just working with these musicians and we're creating art that is focused on raising awareness of humans' relationship with nature. Again, eclectic futurism, that's the niche that I want to focus on. It's like, I don't think we can get rid of technology anymore. If anything, like what I was doing, building trails was a form of technology.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's, a hammer is technology. Holding a rock in my hand and putting it somewhere so I can step on it safely is technology.
It's not about eradicating things. It's about responsibly managing things.
Absolutely. Yeah. Every single film that I do, it has to be just pushing the limits of what humans can do with innovation and technology to establish a more synergistic relationship with nature. Because a lot of these, like, I know that you're into science fiction as well, and so many of these science fiction theories are not theories anymore. And so many of these like mystical woo-woo ideas that people write off, we're not writing them off anymore. anymore. We're understanding that trees are incredibly intelligent and they're communal, and like they developed in symbiosis with mushrooms internet well before we did. You know, the mycelium networks is exactly the same as the internet systems that we use to transfer information.
And if people don't know what he's talking about, there's a really good Radiolab episode that goes in depth about this that you can on your own time go hunt down.
So absolutely. One of my close friends, his mother was on the cover of the New York Times as she was the leader of a team of plant scientists at the University of Washington that for the first time in like skeptical Western science proved that plants are intelligent. I mean, we're really just learning that humans aren't the only ones that are developing intelligence and consciousness. So much of nature around us is, and in many ways is much more advanced than us. Like you think of like, we're at the state where humans are producing so much toxicity. And so we're trying to develop these like filtration systems. How do we get rid of this toxicity? And nature has already created some of the most advanced forms of filtration systems ever that we can't learn more about how to do these things. So that's really what I think my niche is going to be, and my draw, and you know, I'm being really critical in who I work with. I don't want to work on like flashy music videos that are just like eye candy of rampant materialism. I want to work on films that really push human consciousness towards creating a much stronger relationship with nature, and thus working with musicians who espouse that and want to make a positive impact. That's really my personal goal, is just to feel content in life, you know, not to feel like I have to like prove myself to the world, and just trust that like this is the rest of my life path and it's just going to unfold, putting in the work step by step. The one thing I'm really, really thankful for, I think I had just a predisposition to it, kind of runs in my family, but bike racing really honed it in and developed it. It's just a strong work ethic, and a work ethic where it's no longer forced. You know, it's like, especially in the professional world of athletics, people destroy themselves in some pretty negative ways. It's not pretty to watch. You have some like pretty dark things going on in that world where like, oh, it's so inspiring, they're pushing themselves. But to the detriment of what, you know, like there's a lot of depression, there's a lot of like dark mental things going on. So a lot of it is just like trusting the path, like trusting things will work out. Like, why are you doing these things? You know, is it to get rich and famous, or is it to like truly make an impact and make change kind of deal? So this new job working for this record label, and just to kind of give an idea of like Dean's energy, like my boss, you know, it's like he's super close with the Dalai Lama. These are like the people he rolls with, being this old and being in the game that long. And just to like be around that energy just like chilled me the fuck out. Like that's really the best way to put it. Just being like, dude, everything's cool. Just like life is a blast. You get to play outside. You have amazing relationships. All the people in your life are awesome. Like you don't need anything more. Just have fun and play with it as a human. And I think most humans, especially when they're well supported, especially when they're not struggling, especially when they're not in conflict or war or hardship, I think we just like to work. We like to be engaged. We like to create. We like to do, and we like to be. Just trust that that will bring you forward to this feeling of expression and actualization.
I think that's a great encapsulation of a lot of things we talked about today. So what we should do now is you should tell people where they can go to keep up with you and see some of these films that you're working on, and anything else that you like to share with the world.
Yeah, absolutely. I have a very bizarre Germanic name, which caused some interesting experiences in elementary school and middle school. And so my birth name is Daniel Harm, like do no harm. And with my fascination with ecotech futurism and just symbiosis and harmoniousness, my artist name is Daniel Harmony Harm. And I also love paradoxes. We live in a world of many, many paradoxes. And so that's the easiest way to find me. I mean, vimeo.com/Daniel Harmony Harm. If you watch my show reel, you'll see these stunts that I'm talking about, you know, like 50 people hanging off the edge of a cliff. You know, I had one photo shoot where I had 5 people like literally standing on the tops of 100-foot trees with these like giant wings. It's just wild. And it's all just been DIY at this point, and just on my own, knowing that eventually it'll amount to something. Yeah.
And what about the films that you're putting together for the record label?
Yeah, Soundings of the Planet. And they have a YouTube channel. There's a lot of material on it. And so what they're actually going to do is we're going to launch a new YouTube channel, which is their archive. And they just have so much damn content that one of my roles is to help organize it. And they're also on Instagram. YouTube and Pandora and Spotify are their main things. They're getting on Instagram more. And you can also find me on Instagram as well, Daniel Harmony Harm. So eventually, Soundings of the Planet will launch an archive channel, and that is going to be the bomb. They were also involved in a lot of the tribal happenings during the 70s, which is really new to me. One of my favorite books is Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee. It's a very, very heartbreaking book about what we did to the native people in this country. I mean, it was genocide. It was total genocide. We just destroyed and raped and pillaged and conquered mercilessly the people here. You know, it's in the past for sure, and it's just kind of like a part of our human legacy. So a lot of it is like, where do we go from here? Where do we go from here? And this footage from the 1970s, you know, like I had no idea that there was military occupation happening here on U.S. soil during the Vietnam War. I mean, you had in native reservations, full-on tanks, machine guns, exploding buildings, extreme violence. And in here, these are people who are the epitome of living synergistically and harmoniously with nature. They are like the ideals to aspire to. We're talking thousands and thousands of years of wisdom and knowledge and how to live that way. And it's really powerful material. You know, you're essentially hearing the voice of the voiceless within Western culture. Like, we have destroyed and squashed their voices at every possible moment. And we're now in a juncture in history where in many ways, like, they have the answer for us. So I'm pumped to be releasing all this material, and yeah.
So what I always do at the end, and I don't know what you're going to say because I feel like you've already said everything that you could, but I have a feeling you're going to come up with something. I always like to ask people what final thought they'd like to leave the audience with.
My final thought is, don't doubt yourself. That's really what it is. Don't doubt yourself and don't doubt the world. What we need most is for people just to be stoked on figuring out the future. We need to be really excited for the future. And in order to do that, you can't doubt yourself. And there's so much pressure in the world to like be the best of the best. And I think like the best elixir for that is just like your own relationship with your internal world and like your own self. If you're just happy on the inside, it doesn't matter what's happening around the world. Just be content. And being content is having good relationships and being connected to a space and environment. You know, if you're a city kid, then like it's about forming community. If you're a nature junkie, then it's about being out in the wilderness. So to just sum it up, it's like, don't doubt yourself. Being content is the best possible thing. Like, that's the grand prize. And it really doesn't take a lot to be content. It's the people in your life, and it's having a nourishing environment around you. And that's all we need. If we have that, then we can have time and effort to start tackling these like really, really real issues that are going on.
I knew you were going to have something, man. All right. Well, thanks for coming out and doing this.
Yeah.
So I appreciate it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Daniel just completed a live performance installation in Seattle called Matrix of the Trees, featuring a cast and crew of over 30 people. And if you're in the Seattle area, maybe you were lucky enough to catch it. But he also assures me that he has many, many projects in the works, so keep a lookout for more from Daniel Harm. And if this episode did intrigue you, as I promised it would, and you would like to know more, then head on over to our website, gogetoutside.com. Look for this, episode 83 with Daniel Harm, and there you will find photographs and links. I really recommend taking a look at these photographs. You're going to see photos of Daniel in his element, but then you're also going to see examples of some of these installations he does in the wild. People in treetops and ornate costumes on mountaintops. Super cool stuff. Worth taking a look at. Head to the website, check that out. But then there also are going to be links to all the things we talked about in today's show, including a video sample of Daniel's work, links to that Radiolab episode I mentioned, and also, serendipitously enough, the Enormocast just recently did 2 episodes about Mark Twight. Daniel mentioned him as a mentor earlier in this episode, so I've also included links to those 2 episodes of the Enormocast. And if that doesn't keep you busy enough and you want to contact us here at the show, there are a number of ways you can do that. You can always send us an email, go@butcherbirdstudios.com, or you can give us a call, leave us a voicemail, send us a text message at 818-925-0106. And if you would, please do us a great big favor here at the show. Go to your podcast purveyor of choice, subscribe to the show, rate it, review it, share this episode with someone who might enjoy it. This episode of the Go Get Outside podcast was produced and recorded with additional editing by me, your host, Jason Milligan. It was edited by Griffin Davis and, as always, brought to you by Butcher Bird Studios. Next time on the show, come back May 1st. We will be speaking with Cindy Wyatt. This is an episode where we have a great time talking about ultra running, fast packing, modeling, and even the ridiculousness of doing aerobics at spring break. But it is also an episode that gets quite serious as we touch on the topics of dealing with abuse. So come back May 1st for both fun and serious conversation with Cindy Wyatt. See you then.